Hello and welcome to the Extranet User Manager webinar on running effective projects in Office 365 with an additional case study on work we've done with associated engineering. My name is Peter Carson. I'm going to be taking through the bulk of the webinar, although we've got a couple of special client guests, Michelle and Greg, who are going to be joining us as well on behalf of Associated Engineering. I'm the president of Envision IT and Extranet User Manager, as well as a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. We're going to provide a recording of the webinar up on our website afterwards, so if you need to get either the deck or the recording for a colleague that wasn't able to join, we'll send links out after. We should see those tomorrow once we've got the recording polished up and ready to go from that point of view. Quick overview on Envision IT and Extranet User Manager. We're focused on SharePoint and Office 365, very much around building SharePoint websites, intranets, and extranet and collaboration portals. Today's talk is going to be focusing more on the extranet and the collaboration portal side of things. Lots of experience from a general SharePoint point of view. So a quick agenda of what we're going to be talking about here today. Actually, I didn't update the agenda properly here. We were missing a few bits on associated engineering, but basically we're going to start with some background on project management in general, talk about project sites in Office 365, touch on governance, permissions, and external users and site provisioning, but we're going to go through the context of those in the specific case of associated engineering and how they work with their 900 staff and hundreds of clients across the country of Canada here, running lots of different projects. So let's start with a little background on a project management side of things. I mean, you often hear a lot of metrics around project measures. You know, you hear on time and on budget is always a successful metric for a project. What's the ROI or return on investment? How does it align with our strategic goals or objectives, quality, business value, et cetera, are some of the key things that we often see from a project measurement point of view. And you know, I went out to the web and just pulled down a quick 10 rules. You know, everybody loves their top 10 lists, things like that. I won't go through all the different steps on here, but a lot of what you see in here has a lot to do with communications, whether it's from a practice point of view, a planning point of view, visualizing, communicating, open communication. You know, we see that factor coming through over and over again through here. And that's going to be a key thing that we're going to talk about in today's session is how do we effectively communicate both within our internal project team and with our external stakeholders as well. You know, and as we're talking about communication, you know, how are we doing on the project? How are we managing things? The traditional project management triangle, a lot of people are familiar with the idea of time, scope, and cost. You know, you can't optimize all three of those. You can choose one, you can constrain another, and you kind of have to live with the other from that. You know, if you've got unlimited budget, then, you know, you can compress the time and fit in as much scope as you want. Although I'd argue there is a mythical man month in there at some point. You can't put too many bodies on something and actually get it done in an infinitely small amount of time. And also how you manage the projects itself. You know, different methodologies exist, whether we're talking waterfall, the more traditional, you know, we're going to do deep requirements gathering and design before we get into implementation, go through the QA, verification, maintenance steps, or more of an agile approach, which I'm more a fan of actually in terms of, you know, building a backlog, working in iterative sprints, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks in duration, keeping the lines of communication open, keeping it very transparent, and providing at the end of each sprint what's called a potentially shippable product increment or a piece of work that's complete and ready to go, even though it may not cover enough of the business scenario to be something you want to go live with. All the work related to finishing that has been completed within that sprint. And again, because you're going through those iterations, there's lots of communications and room for feedback from that point of view. And that's a key thing in projects, is making sure that those paths of communications are available there. I love this cartoon. A lot of you have probably seen it before. It just kind of goes through the story of, you know, how a customer explains what they want, to how the project leader understood it, how it was designed, developed, described, documented or not, how ops were involved, what the build was for that, you know, what the support was, and really at the end of the day, you know, what the customer really needed wasn't actually what they explained, or in fact what anybody else built along the way through there. And this, coming back to the Agile, one of the big things there is making sure that if things start to get on track, because there's that transparency and that open communications, that you nip that in the bud very quickly. You don't get all the way to the end of the project and realize we've gone completely down the wrong path. So speaking about communications, I mean, there's lots of different methods for people to communicate. We've got sort of the traditional, face-to-face in-person meetings, phone calls. Certainly a lot of people depend on email and documents and attachments to email to communicate. But in the last number of years, a lot more virtual meetings happening, much as we are doing here today. We're not physically together in the same room, but we're able to communicate effectively through that. Instant messaging rather than email, certainly as younger generations, Skype for Business, IM, things like that. Enterprise social, Yammer, portals, places to go to communicate and bring that together. So you've got a lot of different choices from a communication methods, and the key is how do you make effective use of all those different choices. We're going to talk a lot about Office 365 today, and it really pulls together a lot of those different choices, because it's not just a cloud-based service, it's also the productivity tools you install on your mobile device, on your desktop device, and that's become much more cross-platform over the past number of years. We've been seeing a big shift in Microsoft where not just Windows, but Mac, iOS, Android support is there, all the major different browsers, and there's a whole suite of different products that make up Office 365. And we're not going to go through all of them today, but we are going to touch on quite a number of them, particularly as they apply to project management and how do you effectively manage and communicate both within and outside your organization. So let's start with a quick little history tour of project management and where things began from a SharePoint point of view. So this predates Office 365. This goes all the way back to the initial version of SharePoint that was released in 2001. It was actually called SharePoint Team Server. So that idea of teams and having a collaborative space to work really goes right back to the beginnings of SharePoint. And that team site template is still, I would argue, the most popular site template in SharePoint today. And the current template today comes with a document library, a news feed, a OneNote notebook, I'll talk more about that, and a wiki library. And you can always extend that, you can add additional lists and libraries to that, but it's very SharePoint-centric. In fact, if we look at our own organization, I mean, our first introduction to SharePoint was actually this very thing, using team sites. We weren't SharePoint developers. It was back in I think it was 2002 timeframe. I heard about this thing called SharePoint team sites, and we were running these large development projects, and we needed to manage them. We had lots of different document versions, and this idea of a single version of the truth, keeping document history and version history in SharePoint really appealed to me. So we started using SharePoint to run some of our bigger projects, and it actually worked well from a pure document management point of view. And that evolved to the point that as newer versions of SharePoint came out in 2003 and then 2007, we started actually implementing SharePoint for our clients, to the point that by 2008, 2009, pretty much all that we were doing was SharePoint itself, and we pivoted it and refocused the company strictly around being a SharePoint development shop. So those team sites have a lot of history there, but they're equally valid today and very useful going forward from a project point of view. But sometimes you don't need a whole project site for what you're doing. In fact, things like events that we're doing here today, something called document sets actually makes a lot of sense to manage this. In fact, let me fire up a new browser window here and just take you into our events management. How do we do that? So if I go to our Envision IT home, I'm not actually logged into SharePoint right now, so I have to identify who I am, and it takes us over to Active Directory Federation Services, so it does a single sign-on with our AD credentials, and now I'm into Office 365. The place I want to go is down in our Extranet User Manager site. We have an events document library that we keep track of all our events that are going on. So if I open this up, we're using what are called document sets to manage this. So we don't actually have one for the webinar here today. I'm a little behind the 8 ball. I'm keeping stuff in my OneDrive, but we need to get it into a common shared place so everybody has access to it. So we'll actually do that right after the webinar itself. But if we go to the previous webinar that we delivered a couple of weeks ago on extranets in SharePoint and Office 365, everything about that webinar is contained in that document set. And the idea of a document set is you can actually tag it with metadata. So we can set the start and end date for the event, what type of event is it, is there a page to point to on our public site that talks about it, and then the rest is just really a file repository. So think of it like a folder with metadata that you can just drop files into. Those files inherently get tagged with the metadata of the document set itself. So I mean, we've got the attendee report from GoToWebinar, we've got the PowerPoint and the PDF version of that. We've got the actual recordings from the GoToWebinar session. the Premiere editing that was done from a video point of view. So this becomes the working spot for both myself and all the marketing folks to work together on that particular event. But I mean, it only lives for that 1 hour. It's not a big thing. So building a whole team site around that doesn't make sense. So document sets are a nice way of providing an in-between from that perspective. I've actually been giving this talk for well over a year now, and when I started the talk, I said, well, I'm going to build a wish list of what I'd like to see from a project management site. What are the things that I'd like to get into a project site? And at the time, there's been a lot of discussion around Office 365 groups. They were very nascent. They were just getting started at that point in time, so they certainly weren't as mature as they are here today. But I liked the idea that they were bringing out there of using Exchange for email and calendar. This idea that you can create a project site, and that project site actually gets an email address, and you can CC email communications to the project itself. Likewise, it becomes a resource in your calendar. So if you're having a project meeting, you can actually invite the project itself to the meeting, just like you would book a meeting room or a projector or any other resource. The advantage of that is if you're not part of that email communication, or maybe you're not attending that particular meeting, if you didn't have the project in there, you'd have no visibility as to that conversation and what's happening from that point of view. Imagine that you've got a long-standing project that maybe runs for multiple years, and I joined the project team 6 months into the project. There's a whole lot of history that's in people's inboxes of emails that have flown back and forth around that project that are completely invisible to me because they're not, I wasn't CC'd on them, I wasn't even part of the project, maybe I didn't even work for the company at that point in time. But if I can go to the project site and see that email history there, that all those conversations were copied to the project, that's a tremendous resource for me. I can search that, I can see the history, understand the decisions and such from that point of view. Likewise, maybe I'm not invited to particular meetings, but I want to know that they happened. If I can go to the project site and see the calendar for that, that's a great way of pulling that together. OneNote I'm a huge fan of. If you don't use OneNote today, I would strongly encourage you to check it out. It's completely free, so you don't need an Office subscription or an Office license in order to use it. And basically, it's a very ad hoc note-taking tool. Where it really shines, though, is when you start sharing OneNotes between people. And when you create a team site, I mentioned previously, it actually creates a OneNote for the team site. So at Envision IT, every project that we work on has a OneNote associated with it, and then every team member who's working on that project uses that as their go-to place. In fact, if we look at things like calendar invitations, let me actually pull up the calendar invite for this webinar itself. Right in the Outlook client, you'll see here there's a link for meeting notes. I can click on that, say take my notes on my own, and it'll actually pull up a list of all my notebooks. So we can see, there's internal company ones for management operations, and then further down, here's actually the associated engineering ones. Everything going on with that client would be in there. Different clients through there. I can attach that in, and it actually puts all those meeting notes in for me. It'll even include the details from the meeting invite, who all the attendees were, so all the base notes are actually there. So I mean, you can still have a formal meeting agenda, follow-up Word document if you want to. For most purposes, I find OneNote's a much quicker, easier way to do that. It also provides very cool co-authoring, so you could have multiple people in the meeting, all taking notes into the same note at the same time, and they actually see each other's changes live through there. So that was a big thing that I wanted to see in the project management sites. When Office 365 groups first came out, they didn't really support SharePoint fully. It was more like a OneDrive for business type of experience. There was a file repository where you could drop files in, but there was no way to extend that. You couldn't add metadata to it. You couldn't create additional document libraries or custom lists or things like that. Being a SharePoint guy, that was important to me. I mean, the idea of properly tagging and organizing content in that SharePoint site is very important. So I was actually really excited to see this past winter, I think it was about the February timeframe, when they started rolling out support for full SharePoint team sites as part of Office 365 groups. So it's evolving, it's changing, things are coming in from that point of view, but it's coming together nicely from that perspective. And likewise, I want to be able to see custom lists so we can create contact lists or task lists, things like that, fairly easily from that point of view, and really provide all the communications around the project site. Now, projects often aren't internal only. They often need to bring in external users. So how do you collaborate with those external users? Well, you want to be able to share with them. And we're going to dive into that topic a little deeper. There's a number of ways that we can do that. We're using Azure AD B2B, which is a business-to-business service from Microsoft, and our Extranet User Manager product on top of that as part of that sharing side of things. And you may have other external systems. Maybe there's financial systems, time tracking, bug tracking that you want to pull in and make part of that. One of the beauties of SharePoint is it's very good at integrating different systems together and pulling that content together. All right, where did my mouse go? There we are. So in the associate engineering case that I'm going to talk about later, we're actually not doing Office 365 groups. They're more at the team site and the document sets, and I'll explain why in a minute. But I do want to talk about Office 365 groups as part of the background here, because this is kind of the culmination of my wish list and what Microsoft's done. You know, quite happy to see that it actually pulled together quite nicely from that point of view. So Office 365 Groups is really sitting on top of a pretty wide stack of different products from Microsoft. So obviously, you know, we talked about the calendaring side of it, that it creates an email alias and a calendar resource that you can invite as part of Outlook into that. As of February, and I think it's fully rolled out now, it supports full SharePoint team site. So that's great to see that we can do the custom lists and libraries and metadata and all the things we've come to know and love from a SharePoint point of view as part of an Office 365 group. OneNote, I'm a fairly rabid fan. I think I've made that fairly obvious. Calendar we've already talked about. But then some of the other tools, things like Skype and Yammer, are more around the communication side. And I talked previously about styles of communications. I'm going to talk more about this, whether you're more of an email-centric organization or maybe you're more IM and Skype for Business-centric. Maybe you've deployed Yammer from an enterprise social point of view. 365 Groups actually supports all those different things. I mean, this is both a benefit and a danger to a lot of things from Microsoft, is they give you a lot of choices. You know, and you as an organization really need to narrow that down and say, okay, this is how we're going to plan our communications, so people aren't using different tools and maybe missing communications from other groups from there. We also got Planner and Delve and Teams, which are some of the new cool things to join the Office 365 suite. And I'll go into a little bit deeper from that point of view. So I already mentioned this. I mean, there's a link in the deck here that takes you back to the Microsoft article that talks about that integration between team sites and groups and pulling the full SharePoint experience in through there. So some of the other pieces that maybe you're not familiar with from an Office 365 point of view, let's start with Office 365 Planner. And the idea here is it's an extension of 365 Groups. And basically there's a one-to-one relationship. When you create a group, you get a plan that goes with it. You don't have to use it, but it's there and available if you'd like to. And I've got a couple of screenshots on here. I'm not going to go into a live demo of this because I want to save time more for the AE story a little bit later. But basically, it's simplified task management. Now, it's not a replacement for your project server. You know, your PMO office is not going to use it to run massive projects and resource balancing across it. But if you've got quick and dirty projects and you just need a place to track and represent tasks that need to get done on the projects, it's a great way to do that. You know, each task becomes a card in here, can be assigned to one or more people. They can track how far through completion are they, and then they roll up into a what's called a board that basically shows you, as you see on the lower left corner here, you know, what's the status on all your different tasks and how far through on your project basically are you. Then you can roll another level above that as well. It's what's called a hub view that sits above your individual projects, and you can actually see at a higher level organizationally how things are tracking from that point of view. And the Office graph, kind of an overwhelming slide here, but it really is knitting together all the connections between all the different people within your organization, and it's watching that tracking and activity and pulling that through from an analysis point of view and a machine learning point of view. So basically, as you're emailing people, you're inviting people to calendar events, you're working on documents together, all that activity is being tracked by the Office graph. Now freaks a lot of people out. They feel it's a little bit creepy. Oh, Microsoft is watching everything we're doing and it's reading our emails. I mean, it's not to the level that Microsoft is using this for their own purposes. There's very clear privacy rules around what's done with that information, and it's to feed back to the users themselves. And things like Delve are then powered by the Office Graph to collect those signals and provide that activity back. So it uses that machine intelligence, basically builds an automatic profile page that pulls up information either about yourself or your colleagues that it thinks is relevant to you. I'm always a little nervous when I do this from a live demo point of view, but what the heck, let's go for it. So if I go into my Office 365 here and I open up Delve in a new tab, basically it's going to bring up my profile page first and show me what it thinks I would be interested in. So we actually just had an open house at Envision IT last week. We're in a new office. So I can see, Amanda's been working on follow-ups from that, but she's also been doing some stuff from an RFP point of view. We've got Maha's working on some training. Logan's working on some target lists from a marketing point of view. We've got some case studies that we're pushing out. So this is all very relevant information of people around me that are working from that point of view. So I can keep scrolling through this, and it pulls up documents that it thinks are relevant to me from there. Or I can jump over to individuals. Let's say go to Amanda. I can actually see what she's working on that it thinks is relevant to me from here. Now remember that it only shows me documents I have access to, so from a security point of view, it's trimming that down and back. And we can see some of the profile information here as well, contact information, how does Amanda roll up within the organization and such from there. I mean, we're not a big organization, we're 16 people, but as you get into a larger organization, this becomes a very important part of your knowledge discovery, because you have to think about, as good as your project sites are and as good as the content that's in them, there's always going to be a lot of knowledge that are within people's heads as well. And how do you connect to those people and understand who's working on what? Delve and the Office Graph is a big part of that. So as you get into larger project teams, this can be extremely valuable to say, okay, well, I just came out of a steering committee meeting on this project and saw a great presentation on this particular topic. Maybe I want to go find that material. I can find that person, see what they're working on. Odds are that machine learning is going to track it back to that meeting and the presentation and such, and I can actually discover that information rather than having to chase somebody down to say, can you email me a link to what you just saw? It makes it more discoverable through the organization, and that's a very important part of communications. Teams is really another style of communicating. I mentioned there's multiple ways within 365 groups that you can do your communications, your conversations. Teams is more like the instant messaging, but it's persistent. The idea is that there's a history there, and it comes back to my point on the email side. The same thing applies in chat, that if you've got chat conversations going on between 2 or 3 project team members and other team members maybe aren't aware of that, that's a problem because you don't have that visibility. I mean, there is the need sometimes for private conversations, but Teams is really about making those chat, IM style conversations more public, either to the project or the organization as a whole. So again, there's that discoverability, there's that searchability. You can come back and pull that in from that point of view. If you need to flip into voice and video conference, there's nice integration into Skype for Business. Being able to pull in the IM, desktop sharing, things like that from that point of view as well. So lots of very cool tools from that perspective. So that brings us back to the choice question. How are we going to do conversations within our projects? Are we an email-centric organization and Outlook and Exchange makes the most sense? Maybe we've rolled out Yammer from an enterprise social point of view, or maybe we're a little bit younger demographic, Slack really appeals, but we want to keep it within the Office 365 stack. Teams is really the answer to that Slack style of collaboration and communication. The danger, though, is that if you've got half of your team members using email and the other half using Teams, those don't cross each other, and there's going to be a lot of missed communications from that point of view. So I'm not saying as an organization you have to pick one of these and only use that for everything you do in the organization, but I am strongly encouraging you that if you're running a project site, choose one of these for the project site and stick with that one for the project itself. It can vary from project to project, but it shouldn't be multiple within the project itself. And really, in my mind, for the most part, it's a choice between Exchange email and Teams persistent chat. Unless you're deeply invested in Yammer, a lot of organizations aren't. I wouldn't see spinning up Yammer just to support projects, but if you're already very used to Yammer from an enterprise social point of view, it can certainly make sense from a project's point of view as well. All right, so let's talk a bit about governance and permissions. It's a word that we hear a lot in the SharePoint world. It frightens a lot of people around things getting out of control, but also maybe putting too many rules and restrictions in, and that limits user adoption. There's always a balance from that point of view. But you do really need to think about this. I mean, a good governance plan it should be part of any Office 365 project. I don't mean a project site, I mean Office 365 as a whole. And really it's about defining roles and responsibilities, not just who's allowed to do what, but why they should do it and what's the scenario. You know, I may be a site collection administrator and I can change the branding and the master page on my site, but maybe I shouldn't, or maybe there's checkpoints I should go through before I make that decision. So training becomes a big part of that as well, understanding that just because you've got the rights to do something doesn't mean you necessarily always should go ahead and do it. What's the thought process that should go into that? I mean, you can restrict some of that through permissions, and they are a key part of that, but it's not just about permissions. It's about education and it's about training as well from that point of view. I mean, the danger is you just let everybody do whatever they want from a permissions point of view, and that's where things often get completely out of whack, and you have no idea who has access to what, because inheritance has been broken so many different times through there. So if we think about permissions specifically in SharePoint, because that's where this really applies. You know, the Exchange side of things, the Teams persistent chat, much less so from that point of view. But within a SharePoint team site, let's call it, there's a number of levels that we can apply permissions at. We can apply it at the top site level. We can say, okay, an individual list or library has unique permissions on it, or maybe even a folder or an item within that list or library. Now the danger about making it too granular is, again, it gets too complicated and you lose track of it and it becomes very difficult to manage. So we recommend, from a governance point of view, you only apply permissions at those top two levels, either the site or the list or library. And there's specific cases, and we're actually going to bring one up today with associated engineering, where we actually do go down to the item level. But it's a very unique and very controlled situation within that. And who you apply those permissions to can be a number of different things as well. It can be an individual user, it can be a group. And groups is, unfortunately, an overused word. I mean, we've talked about Office 365 groups as a product idea. It actually has a security group under the hood within that. But there's also SharePoint groups that are different than that. There's Azure AD groups, which are actually pretty much one-to-one with Office 365 groups. And we actually manage our own groups called Extranet User Manager groups. Again, they're built on top of Azure AD or Office 365 groups. Best practices is don't give individual people permissions. You know, if there's 3 people in your project, don't grant permissions to those 3 people, because the project team members are going to change, and you're going to take one out and put 2 in, and you have to remember all the spots that you've done that. It gets confusing and hard to manage from that point of view. Create a group for the project, and then put the people into that group. And when one person leaves and 2 people join, you're just changing the membership of that group. You don't have to worry about going and changing permissions in all the different places where it's been applied. So much safer from that point of view. So this idea of applying permissions versus putting people into groups can actually be 2 different people. So in a lot of organizations, they like to keep their SharePoint environment fairly locked down. And that's the example we're going to show you in Associate Engineering, where the people that request the sites, the project managers themselves, don't have rights to change permissions on their site. And that's done to protect themselves from themselves. That we don't want them breaking inheritance and messing permissions up, and maybe people who shouldn't see things, seeing things that they shouldn't. But at the same token, they need to be able to invite people in. They need to add and remove project team members. So give them ownership of the groups, but manage the permissions separately from that. That's the key takeaway here, is separate those 2 things. Group ownership and management of the membership is one thing, and that should definitely lie with the business. They should be able to decide who they're going to work with on a particular project, versus permissions. You want to more tightly control that to make sure that they're applied properly within the SharePoint sites. So that's a good segue now. We've been bringing up the associate engineering side a fair bit here. Let's actually dive in for the second half of the webinar more specifically into their particular scenario. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce Greg and Michelle, and I'm going to let Michelle talk a bit about background of associate engineering first.
Thank you, Peter. I am Michelle Tarrant. I'm a business systems analyst with Associated Engineering for the last 4.5 years. I am PMP certified as well, so that means I've gone through a lot of systems projects in my life. And when joining Associated Engineering, their main issue is production projects. So we work as a consulting engineer firm, so we will partner with our clients in a lot of cases, and we also have a lot of sub-consultants and contractors and just general interested stakeholders that are not staff. As such, over the years, things have evolved. Traditionally, they were working off of all the projects were email exchange based, as well as a file server repository for their work and their records. Over time, the world has changed, and we've introduced some automation to the ecosystem, but that was still internal only. And then they opted for FTP sites for external sharing.
Sorry, Michelle, I'm having a little grief with
audio?
With PowerPoint. It crashed on me, so I'm just getting things back up from a presentation point of view. You're doing a great job. Keep going.
All right. I also, like Peter, discovered SharePoint in the early years. I think it was 2003 when I first discovered the platform as a whole. And as such, that opened up a lot of collaboration opportunities, internal as well as custom solutions to solve business problems. I have evolved with the platform as it has evolved as well, and taking that knowledge business to business. At Associated Engineering, again, the demographic is changing. So a lot of our staff is of an older generation, and a lot of new staff are coming in, and file server processes and manual file-based centric processes are not as effective as they would like to see. So now we have to bridge that gap between the traditional and the modern. And how did we do that? Well, we started with a SharePoint pilot project, which was an on-premise installation. And part of my job was to educate the business on what it could do for us and how we could leverage it. As the slide shows now, it definitely quickly became production, and over 80 project sites happened to evolve into this platform. That put a little bit of stress on our IT team, saying, oh my gosh, how many moving parts for this on-prem are there? And what is the risk? As such, it was time to make it a production offering rather than a pilot. And that's where the Office 365 environment came to be. The first part of us to get into that environment was our Exchange. We took that from a hosted solution and migrated to Office 365 for Exchange. And then we wanted to see what else could the platform do for us. Now that there is a Canadian data center for us, and that was a huge important part for our clients to make sure that our data was in Canada, then it opened up the gates to do a migration to 365. Along the way, we had a very significant project come to us as well, and that involved over 100 external parties. And there was no way to keep that chaos organized using email and file server. As such, we have now migrated to our 365 environment and partnered with Envision IT to help us keep control over those external parties. As of right now, I just did a check, we have approximately 450 active external users collaborating on projects in our environment.
Very cool. And I think I've almost got PowerPoint cooperating again. Apologies on that.
No worries. There is 35 project sites active right now, and that is without communicating to the business that we offer this service. So that was just by word of mouth. I have a project site, let's use it, it's great. In addition to that, though, like Peter has said, not all of them are warranting a full site offering. And in that case, we're using a single collaboration library on our portal, and we have 44 work groups working in that environment as well. All right.
Cool. So why don't I jump in for a minute here? Let me just talk a bit about the solution, just to recap from that point of view. So what we've done is work with Associated Engineering, who was already an Office 365 customer. So they were running Exchange online and moved into SharePoint from an online point of view. We've used our extranet user manager tool, and we're going to show you in a minute what that looks like, to allow that delegation. That idea I was talking about before, the project site owners, project managers should decide themselves who's going to come into their site. So that delegation feature is very important. We also built some automation around site creation. We're going to show you some workflows and lists and customizations that we've done in SharePoint to allow it to be very self-service for project site owners to request new sites and have those created in a very standardized templated approach. And then from a migration and single sign-on point of view, we provided ShareGate to Associated Engineering and some training around that. And they actually did the migration of the existing sites from their on-premises SharePoint up into Office 365. We've actually looked at putting in ADFS from a single sign-on point of view. That's still in the investigation stage right now as well. So if we look at the results coming out from that, I mean, the biggest thing driving the project initially was around high availability and disaster recovery. From a technical point of view, that pilot that Michelle mentioned, that was the beginning of the SharePoint journey for Associated Engineering, was never intended to be production grade, and yet it became production critical from that point of view. So the question was, do you invest in a whole lot more licenses and hardware to make that production ready, or do you move to the cloud? And the dollars just didn't make sense to make that investment on premises, particularly when they were already paying Office 365 subscriptions. They've already made the investment there. It's just a matter of what's the effort of moving that across into Office 365. But then also the idea of automation around the project site creation to make it very easy. We're going to show you the legacy process that pre-existed this and the new process that we've got in place now and the improvements that are being made from that point of view. And then the last point around subscriptions, as Michelle mentioned, we've got, what was the number, 450 external users already in without doing a lot of marketing around that. The key is that those users don't actually need their own Office 365 subscriptions for Associated Engineering. They may have their own, but it's not a prerequisite. So there's no additional licensing on Associated Engineering's point of view to bring those external users in. Because we're using the Azure B2B service, it's set up for that scenario from that point of view.
The other key part why we wanted to do this was to ensure that the look and feel is what the business has defined. So rather than have it manually configured every single time for every single project site, that's where the partner and the automation comes in. Back to you.
Right. Absolutely. So Michelle, why don't you take a minute and describe the legacy process, which I understand goes back quite a few years within your organization.
Absolutely. They start off the process very, very, very manually, and they use an Excel workbook. They fill in a lot of information, circulate that particular document around for approvals, review, all those types of things. Finally, it gets to the point where we're ready to create our project workspace. We have a custom tool called Progenit. That tool was about 15 years old. As I said, it became a little bit onerous for IT to keep provisioning these spaces, so we've introduced a custom automation at that time. And this tool allows us to handle both the electronic folders on the file share as well as a paper repository for offsite storage for our records. What the tool does is it provisions an Active Directory security group for the project team. It creates the folder structure on the file server, and optionally, if the team is interested in having an FTP site created, it automates that process as well. That is as far as it went until a team arrived, because we don't do these things in isolation, and the company didn't have the expertise in-house for SharePoint or even know what it could do for them. So as the team evolved and we brought that expertise in-house, so did our solution. And now, going forward, do you want me to keep going there, Peter?
Sure, yeah, let's talk about the new process that we're going to be showing today.
All right. So as I mentioned, it was very manual and it starts with Excel. That was not, although it is a pain point, it is not the biggest pain point. The biggest pain point was actually executing the projects, and therefore that's where our focus has gone. We have our Progenit tool still in play, and we're modifying it now. Instead of requesting a FTP site for file sharing, we're going to create a level 1 site template for the project to use. That will use Office 365, and it will also create a list item in our portal, and that's where it gets really fun, because it will create a site for it, put a link on our portal so that every user that has permission to it can navigate to that once they're invited through EUM.
Cool. So let me actually jump in here from a technical point of view then and talk a bit more about what's happening under the hood here. We've got a lot of different boxes on the right-hand side, and they're all very interrelated. So I'm going to start by just talking through, and then I'm going to jump actually out into the site itself and kind of walk you through how that process works. So as Michelle mentioned, we didn't address the front end. It's still the Excel. It's still a manual transposition from that into the ProJNet tool. But ProJNet has been updated, so it now, in addition to being able to create file shares, it can actually kick off the process in the SharePoint side of things. And the way that's done is we actually have a web API. I'll show you the interface to that from a technical point of view in a minute, that basically drives that whole process. So what ProJNet does is it writes an entry into a project master list to say, here's a new site that I need. That triggers off a workflow in SharePoint. The workflow calls out to an API that we built that creates the site. It applies the site template to it. It creates one or more external user manager groups, and we'll talk more about what that is as well. And then it knits all that together from a permissions point of view. So when somebody requests the project and it gets approved and it gets kicked off in ProJNet, everything else flows automatically from that. You get a very defined project site template that's created. All the permissions for both the internal staff and the external partners are all set up appropriately through there. And then the keys are given back to the requester to say, here's your project site. You own the groups, and you can then decide who you want to bring into your project site from there. So we've got that nice balance of governance saying, well, you can't completely make a mess of your project site because we gave you a very structured template to begin with. You don't have the ability to modify permissions and things in there, so there is that level of control around it, but you absolutely get control on who's coming into that site and which of your external partners as well as staff need to be part of that project site is absolutely part of what the site owner is able to do themselves. So let's have a look at how that actually wires together. So I'm going to come over to one of my Chrome windows here, and I'm actually in the main portal site. So this is actually the jump off place for anybody coming to any of these project sites. And the way this site works is that there's a library for document sets. So just like us with our events, there's scenarios where teams just need a spot to collaborate on a few documents, and they don't really need a whole project site for that. So they can create a net new document set in here and then manage the permissions into that as to who's going to co-author those documents with them. Or they can decide, we need a whole project site for this, and the project sites are listed on the right-hand side over here. Now, I mentioned from a permissions point of view, we generally don't like to set permissions at the item level. This is a scenario where we actually do that, and for good reason. The idea is that the members of the various different projects should see the links on this page to be able to get to their project sites, but they shouldn't see any projects that they're not members of. And that's important for staff members. It's doubly important for external users. If I'm part of this AEBC project site here, I shouldn't, and I'm an external to the organization, I shouldn't see all the other project sites. I should only see that one link in there. So what we do from a permissions point of view is we give everyone access to this site, so anybody can come into this site itself, but then we lock down the permissions on the individual list entries and document sets to the groups that control access to the site. So when somebody adds a new member to a group and they now have access to that project site, it automatically just lights up in this list for them. So when they come here, they've got an easy way to guide them down into that project site. Because often associate engineering is working with these same external partners on multiple different projects. They may have 3 or 4 different projects. They would actually see 3 or 4 different links through here. So that's one of the purposes for this. The other is it's actually the glue that knits this whole site automation together. So if I actually come down into the project collaboration sites list itself, so the previous view was the main web page. It's just showing me a filtered down view of that list. Here we see the full set of data on that list. And basically what happens is when a new project gets created in ProJNet, it actually creates an entry in this list. And we can see here, this last column here is actually the workflow column. And it's tracking the creation of the project site. So ProJNet creates a list entry in here, and it defines all the details around what's the name of the project, who are the contacts, any alternate links, which template should be used from a provisioning point of view. And then as soon as that list entry gets created, the workflow kicks off. and it fires off over to an API that actually then builds out the site. So it takes a couple minutes for the site to be provisioned, but once it's all done, it sends an email back to the project contact email to say, hey, your site is now ready to use, and they can start putting content into it and working with it from there. So if we have a look at a couple of the examples, the one that we're going to focus on here is a webinar demo 2. So this is what's called a level 1 template. There's 2 levels indicating different levels of complexity of project to the site templates that Associated Engineering is using. So we actually provisioned this one through the process early this morning. Didn't want to do it through the live demo just because it takes a little while to go through that process. But we can see that we've got the project manager listed in here. We may have announcements related to the project, contacts, and then we've got a number of document libraries. Is there construction photos? Is there project documents that we need to keep in here? If I come down into the project documents, we've actually set up some content types as part of the site template, so I can create an AE document set in here. And the reason we're doing this is we like to categorize documents. Maybe this is a construction document that we're creating through here. And much like we saw on our events library, now any documents that get dropped into that folder are going to be tagged as construction. So it's very easy then to be able to organize that. People are used to being able to just drag and drop files into here and not worry about metadata. The metadata actually happens automatically through the document sets itself. So that's sort of a quick tour around the project site. What I want to talk about, though, is how did this come into being? How did we actually create the template and create the site itself? Well, what we do is we actually start with just an out-of-the-box site. So in this case, we started with a base project site, and we've created a template site from that. So here I can come to a level 1 site template. Whoops, I'm in the wrong browser. I got too many sessions going here. Hang on a sec. Let me come back to my incognito. I'm actually logged in as 2 different IDs on the 2 different Chrome sessions. So what Associated Engineering has done, actually Greg and Michelle have done, is they've basically hand-built this site the way they want that template to look, and then we've actually taken a snapshot of that. We use what's called the Office Dev P&P, the Patterns and Practices tools that Microsoft has open sourced. A big part of those tools is around site provisioning. So we have the ability to actually point some PowerShell at this site and say, capture the structure of this site, everything about it, the branding, the different lists and libraries and views that are in there, the site columns, the content types, everything that's unique about this site, capture that into an XML file. And then we can use that to apply it to other sites. So when we think back to the site list here and the template ID, this ID is basically keying back to that XML file to say use XML file 1 or XML file 2 to apply the appropriate project site template onto the newly created site. So as a project manager, I've got my site now. I'm starting to load content up in there, but it's pretty lonely on there by myself. How do I bring other people into that? And that's really where the Extranet User Manager side comes into it. So let's actually flip over to another page here. And I'm going to go into the admin console on Extranet User Manager. So the goal around EUM, or Extranet User Manager, is really, the primary thing is around delegation of management of users and the groups that they belong to. Allowing that delegation to happen not just to people within your organization, but actually externally delegating itself as well. I mean, if you've seen some of our other webinars, we've got some interesting scenarios where that delegation happens to the external parties themselves. But let's start by having a look to see what the site provisioning process created for us. So this is a list of all the groups. This is a dev site, so they're all sort of made up names through here. But we'll see the last one in the list called Webinar Demo. That was actually created as part of the provisioning process. So it created the site, but it also created this Extranet User Manager group as part of that as well. And it made me, as the site owner, an owner of this group. And what that means is I have the ability to come in and add members into this site or add net new users in altogether. Now right now I'm logged in as what's called a configuration editor, so I see all sorts of things. I can change the welcome email that goes out to users, configure Office 365. I mean, that's more of an IT role. If I was simply a group owner, all I would see is the ability to search, add individual, or bulk load a set of users. So I can come in here and I can actually pull down an Excel template, fill it in with the 10 or 20 people that need to be on my project, import it, and they'll all get invitations and be able to collaborate on that site. I'm going to go through the process of just adding an individual user and give you a sense of what that looks like. So I'm just going to use a slightly different email address because I've already got myself in there once from a demo point of view. Different types of users, we're going to focus on Azure B2B, and because I want them to come into my site, I'm going to put them into that webinar demo group. Now I'm seeing all the groups because I'm at that configuration editor level, but if I only own that one group, that's the only one that I would see as an available choice through there. So it's very granular from a security point of view in terms of how those permissions are managed. Now the thing to remember about how this B2B service works is that these external people that you're inviting in are going to come in with their own credentials. So I'm actually an Office 365 user myself. I'm in our Envision IT Office 365 right now, so we can see envisionit.sharepoint.com as the URL there. But I want to come into the associate engineering site. So if I come over to my inbox, sometimes it takes a minute for those emails to come through. But actually, let me pull up the one from an hour or two ago for my testing through. It basically looks the same through here. I can download the pictures. Now, the version that Associate Engineering is running right now, the email actually comes from Microsoft. We actually just released a new version that we haven't deployed to AE yet, where we actually take over that email invitation process. So we can completely brand that. It comes from your organization rather than from Microsoft, and provide a tighter user experience from that point of view. But the end goal is the same, is to get a link on the email out that's going to point into that site. So when I click on this link here, it's going to come to my Chrome window here that, remember, I'm already logged in on my Envision IT account, but I'm trying to go to an Associate Engineering site. So it says, welcome to Associate Engineering. And you can customize some of the copy that comes up in here. And we can see down here, it's fairly small, but after sign in, I'm going to get redirected to /site/portal. If you remember, that's the site that has the list that becomes the jumping off point for everybody from that point of view. So the email goes to that same site there. I click on the next link here. Takes a second to accept, and now I'm at that same project sites view. Now, Office 365 looks a little different to me. If I come back to my other window here, let me go to the home on this one. So I'm in the same site here. You'll notice I've got the green bar up at the top. I've got my app launcher to launch out to my Outlook or calendar, things like that, as an associated engineering staff member. When I'm in this one as a guest, I just see a black bar up at the top. I don't have that app launcher because I don't have access to anything other than SharePoint through here. You know, I do have a gear, but because I'm not a site owner, there's very little I can do from that point of view. But I can drill down into the different sites here. Now, we haven't locked down the permissions. That's still a to-do on the workflow to remove access to all the different sites that I shouldn't see through the list here. But ultimately, if I was only a part of that webinar demo, then I would only see that one link in the list through there. And then when I click through that and I go to that Webinar Demo 2 site, I'm actually into that project site that I just created earlier this morning. But I'm logged in using my Envision IT credentials. I'm not using an Associate Engineering credentials. Now there are some caveats around that. Let me jump ahead a little bit on the slideshow just to take you through some of that. So if we come ahead, some of these are there more just for reference. I've got some links around the partner patterns and practices stuff and the provisioning engine. So if you're curious about the more technical details of how we take that template site and the empty out of the box and merge that together, there's some good links that go into that. But I want to talk more about the B2B experience and how those external users come into the associate engineering site. So basically they can be granted access to any part of SharePoint Online. We can see there that they've got access to the main top-level portal site, plus any project sites that they get invited into. The second point is very important, that they're considered external users by Microsoft. What that means is you don't have to pay a subscription for them. And we can apply permissions through Azure AD groups, which is what we're managing through Extranet User Manager. So when I was inviting that user and putting them in a group, under the hood, that's all happening in Azure AD, and all the permissions flow into SharePoint. Now, how that user logs into Microsoft has a dependency on what their user experience is going to be. And the easiest is the one that I showed you, where they are an existing Office 365 user. So they just use their regular Office 365 credentials. In fact, if they're already logged in, it's very seamless, and they just go right into the portal. So that's kind of the best case scenario. The next case is you've invited them with their corporate business email, so they're not using a consumer Gmail account or anything like that. But that email is not set up in Azure AD, so they're not currently working with the cloud with Microsoft. What happens is Microsoft actually creates a tenant for that organization behind the scenes, allows them to set their password, set some profile information, and there's things like forgotten password or reset later. Microsoft manages that whole process for them. Now, the third scenario, if they are coming in, say, with a Gmail account or a Hotmail account, they actually need to convert that to a Microsoft account. And I find this one a little bit confusing because it takes sort of half a dozen different steps to go through, and people often get confused and lost going through that. So I would recommend, they call it Azure B2B for a reason. Originally, they blocked consumer email addresses altogether, but I encourage you to try and use non-consumer emails as much as possible when you're partnering with your external organization. But sometimes you have, one of subcontractors that are part of a project team, and all they have is a Gmail account. You kind of have to use that one. So you might need some coaching with them to get through the process. The other caveat that I want to warn people about is this last point here, where the tenant can be converted to a fully managed Azure AD tenant later. That can actually bite you a little bit. We've had this case with Associated Engineering where they've invited in some provincial government users using their government email address. They weren't set up in Azure AD, so it created the tenant, let them set their password, do all that. But then IT at that government organization said, hey, we should start taking control of Azure AD and doing some things with it. They started a little pilot, not knowing that other people within the organization were already using it for other purposes, and actually broke the access from that point of view. So something to be aware of, just a little danger from that point of view. But the idea that you don't need a subscription, that you don't need another password, it's a regular account that you're using already, are big benefits from a B2B point of view. I mean, the real limitations that I see is this idea around delegation. You can delegate into the Azure portal and let people invite directly against B2B through there. One thing is that's very confusing. If you've ever gone into the Azure portal, it's not something you want to expose your end business users to, because it's a very technical portal. But also it's an all or nothing. So if they can invite people in, they can manage all the users that are in there, not just the people that belong to their project. There's also no self-registration or approval. Associated Engineering are doing an invitation only, but a lot of our clients want people to be able to self-register, go through an approval process, and then get assigned to a project site or to a secure publishing site from there. Integration of other line of business systems, what we're doing with the workflows and the ProGenit application, wiring all that together. I mean, you can build it directly against Azure, but it's a fairly technical implementation. And likewise, if you want users to be able to access on-premises, Active Directory, there's some unique hybrid things that we're working on there. So there's more stories that come from that point of view. So at the end of the day, I mean, we provide the self-registration, the profile management, and the delegation as the keys through there. We manage the invitation process. Microsoft still manages the login process, but we manage the group membership and the permissions side of things. So we're getting close to the 2 o'clock mark. Let me just bring up a couple of wrap-up points, and I think Michelle wants to comment on a few of these as well. Groups are a great way to manage projects. There's a lot tied in there. You don't need to start with everything. I mean, the whole journey with Associated Engineering started last fall while groups were still evolving. The decision was made to stick just with team sites and document sets. And you know what, for their purposes right now, that's working very well for them. So you don't need to try and get everything in there. It can be overwhelming for an organization. So choose what makes sense for you and just use that. And on the same token, be aware that Office 365 is changing very quickly. So you're going to see changes there, and you're going to keep on top of that and try and communicate that from a change management point of view. That can be a challenge as well. If you are looking at using groups, you really need to decide the conversation format. You're going to use Outlook email style, you're going to use Yammer, you're going to use the Teams persistent chat model. It's important to, at least at the project level, lock that down and choose the appropriate one from that point of view. Governance plan is important, making sure your policies around your external users are appropriate there. What is your information architecture, get your site templates right, build a site provisioning process around that are all important success points from there. Michelle, other comments that you want to throw in there?
Yeah, okay, there we go. Mostly it's about the change management, as you've outlined, and the governance plan is about why and when and how and who and all of that. And that is key. And for us, when we started this in the middle of 2013, the platform of Office 365 was changing rapidly. On the on-prem side, it was much easier to define a site template and apply it on a request basis. However, with 365, there are differences between the platform, and if you are having an on-prem, be prepared for those differences because they could also bite you as well. Overall, though, it is about the change management and keeping in line with your culture. We have 2 templates in the work right now, one for simple file sharing, one for actual collaboration, but some of our projects go into double decades, and as such, those require a custom approach for those team needs as well. So even though you can automate a lot, there's still going to be that on-demand custom configuration requirement. And that's our story. And I couldn't have done it at all without you or Greg on our side.
Much appreciated. Well, I thank you for both of you for all your support. It's been a great project to work on, and lots more still coming from that point of view. Just having a quick look at questions. I know we're at the 2 o'clock mark. There was a bit about document sets and metadata and folders. Certainly we can follow up back afterwards on that side of things. And absolutely, if there's other questions people have, my contact information is in the deck. Feel free to reach out, and we can certainly have a conversation and follow on from there. So from there, I want to thank everybody for their time today, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.